Hey babies! Let's get started with the context menu. We admit, we've often read that web development was easy, but now that we've been doing it for a while, we are not really seeing it. We mean, relative to other things. Is this easier than working on a programming language or making your own machine learning library? It is not really too difficult for us, but that is more of a matter of us being good at programming in general, rather than the task being easy. Despite being at it for a few months, it still feels like our knowledge of it is very slight. The job market is in a pitiful state, but we honestly can't blame the employers for ignoring our resume. Right now we wouldn't want to hire ourselves. Maybe by the end of the year we'll actually be good at web development itself. Anyway, the way to intercept the right click is to pass an event handler function into the onContext menu event emitter. Then to prevent the default behavior, what we have to do is call the method with that name. You can't see it on the screen, but we are right-clicking and the menu is not showing up. This is as we intended. What we want to do next is create the menu itself and have it appear where we clicked. The context menu itself is just a regular React element, so all we need to do is pass it the X and Y coordinates where the user has clicked and position it there through the style properties. We'll do that through the function arguments. We'll also pass in the isVisible for good measure. Dear viewers, we apologize for our somewhat unskilled handling of TypeScript. This is the first time we are using it in 3 years, so it will take us a little time to get used to it. The best practices in TypeScript aren't the same as in F#. For example, we really should have just written out the interface for the function arguments right away, but instead we are messing around with writing them in the function itself, which was a mistake. We'll have to get used to writing out the type signatures for all the arguments. It is a pity Writer doesn't have an option to generate all the fields directly. We are so lazy, we need to get used to writing things by hand. Thankfully, the editor itself gives us hints so we don't make spelling errors. At this point, you can see what we are going for here. We'll have X, Y, and isVisible be a part of React state and pass them in as variables into the component. The editor gives us all the prop arguments here, but it is better to just spread them, since we have the component state in an object. We had to look up what the exact syntax for this was, we so lack skill at the moment. We remember back in late 2021 applying for a job and doing a HackerRank problem in TypeScript. It took us an hour to figure out how to split a string and half an hour to create an interpreter for a calculator. It happens sometimes. We made another mistake just now. In the context menu component, we really should have just put in an else branch and returned an empty div, but instead we omitted the isVisible attribute and decided to leave the job for later. It was just too bothersome. We'd have done it in F#, but it is such a chore to write return. We are not thinking right. Right here, we also thought that width and height would get inherited from the parent, but we were wrong. We'll have to put that in explicitly. We also missed putting a relative on the outer div and absolute on the context menu itself. And after we fix those, right-clicking gives us the context menu. What we have to do next is figure out how to make it go away after it gets unfocused. Amongst the browser tabs, you can see we are using some other YouTubers as reference just in case we get stuck, but it hasn't happened so far. We'll do this next part as per the examples, but we don't really like the ref using solution. We are going to have to think about whether we can avoid the use of those somehow. Right now, let us wrestle with the visibility issue. We are confused as to how TypeScript types are working here. We had to look it up, and we realized that our problem was not using curved parentheses. We wonder how those are called. I guess we'll call them JSX expressions, in lieu of anything better. Correct us in the comments if we are wrong. Anyway, we are just imitating the reference, but since we are passing the visibility into the component, we'll go back to our earlier design. We are struggling here a lot more than we should, due to needing to acquire new habits. Instead of passing in a function like this, we should be passing a reducer dispatch, and using a global state management library like Zustand to get it, but let's just roll with this for the time being. Just understand that this doesn't have our seal of approval as far as design goes exactly. We'll get back to this and architect it properly later. We just realized something. We could have used an intersection of the two types, the context menu state and context menu dispatch, instead of passing them as separate arguments. That would make things more succinct. As we said earlier, we are really struggling to write this in a brief manner, but JavaScript just has zero brevity. It is much like C# in that regard. Is there a language out there with TypeScript's type system, but with F# syntax? If that existed, we'd switch to it in a heartbeat. We asked that same question of Bing and got back some gibberish, so we guess not. We'll have to persevere with what we have. We'll get used to it eventually. Anyway, we have the intersection type done. We have what we need to set the state of the context menu to invisible. What we need is some kind of listener to actually trigger it. The way to do that is to go out of the React box and set it on the DOM itself. The way React asks us to pass in the dependencies explicitly instead of knowing those by itself is a bit loose. We really should have been passing every variable and lexical scope it is capturing that isn't a constant. And the same goes for constant reactive variables. We are a bit confused whether that applies to the reference itself. We think the reference itself isn't reactive even though its contents should be. We peeked at the React docs, and it says the linter should warn us if we make a mistake, so let's roll with that. Now this next part is a bit confusing for us. We are using a YouTube video as a reference, but we do get the feeling the author copy-pasted it from somewhere without understanding exactly what it did. We'll have to pause a bit and do some research. The HTML element should be looking at whether it has the mouse event target, that much is clear, but the types are clearly not right. We could ignore it like the reference author did, but we'll dig in deeper instead. We'll make it type correct by using that instance of. Really, the type system is our friend. Imagine if we were trying to do this using raw JavaScript, things would have been a lot harder. We'll finish listener and factor it out into a function. Note, don't just blindly copy-paste everything you see out there. It closes the context menu even if we click on its surface. This is bad. It might be due to that instance of failing. Let's try changing the check into a HTML element. We got fooled this time. The code we had written previously started working when we restarted the Vite server. It seems hot module reloading is far from perfect. We noticed the error persisting when we commented out the close. And with that, we have created the basis for the context menu. We hadn't explained it, but the way the document event emitters work is that they source all the events for the whole document to the individual components, so if we want to check for on-click events from the whole document, that is where we need to put the handler. And that is where they are. Anyway, now that we've gotten used to TypeScript and React a little, we'll implement some real functionality. We'll make it a real menu with a selectable item to add a button. For that we'll have to learn some styling. In our previous project, we did everything raw, but for this one we'll do some research to make it look nice. We'll pause and come back with the results. The video by Theo we'll link to in the card has shown us the light. We'll give the style of pasting DaisyUI components a try. First, let us show you the installation process, and then say some key notes about the Tailwind editor plugin. The way to install Tailwind is easy. First, install these 3 packages you see on the screen as a dev dependency. Then run npx TailwindCSS init p, don't forget the p. After that, you need to go into the Tailwind config.js file. Add what you see on the screen here into the content field. Next, we'll install DaisyUI. Just install the package regularly using the package manager, using the command you see on the screen. After that, put require DaisyUI into the plugins field. Now everything should be installed. Something like this is what you can find in the online instructions. For us, that is when the problems started. The Rider plugin for Tailwind CSS is broken. If you are using Rider, press Ctrl-Alt-S to go into the settings. We already have it installed, but in the Plugins tab is where you can install it. Anyway, it doesn't work right now. We looked through the issues, and this plugin in particular seems to flip-flop between working and not working over the years. Right now, it's in the latter state. Another issue we've run into with Rider is that it complained about the encoding type for CSS files, so we converted the file we had to UTF-16. That ended up breaking the compiler. The CSS files need to be UTF-8. The VS Code plugin works better. In fact, we'd go as far as saying it is usable. If you are using VS Code, just type Tailwind CSS in the Extensions tab and install it like we have. The only problem with this plugin is that the Tailwind-specific commands in the CSS files, like the ones you see on the screen, aren't recognized. But other than that, it works great, and it will, for example, autocomplete both DaisyUI and Tailwind CSS classes in both HTML and TSX files. It also provides the CSS properties underneath them on hover. The regular CSS plugin for VS Code doesn't work in TSX files, so this is nice. It won't give you completions for your own definitions in those files. We had to go through all of this yesterday, and it was so much trouble that it made us consider ditching Tailwind for a component library. We are back-end leaning, so we might very well do that in the future, but we'll want to style React Flow components and do not want the style to clash with the components library. Anyway, today we'll try out a new style of front-end engineering, at least for us. In our previous project, we used raw CSS, and we know as much of it as we are comfortable learning. Because front-end work is so time-consuming, it would be a huge waste of our time to specialize in it any more than we have. We'll take the lesson from Theo about not caring how the inline CSS looks like to heart, and the way we will work will be to just go to the DaisyUI site. Over here. Then we'll go into the docs. And the docs have a list of all the components. Since we are working on a drop-down menu, we need something like a button group. We'll go into that, select the one that we need, and paste it into the TSX in our own file. This copy-paste style of working is how the library is intended to be used. Personally, we are used to desktop UI libraries, so this is not how we usually work, but we might as well try it out. There is a first time for everything. If we run into unexpected trouble with CSS classes, we'll switch to a component library later on. Actually, let's go with the drop-down specific components. Right now we don't really care too much about the styling, we just want our workflow to be easy. That is the most important thing of all. Our goal will be to just have a single button, and clicking on it should add a node where the user right-click to open the context menu. The menu items are too large, and we'd like it if there was a title on the top, but we'll leave dealing with that for later. And the library is already giving us trouble. To be honest, yesterday we looked into some of the other components, and we are really confused as to how some of the things are triggered. For example, you'd have a button and it would open a modal box, but there isn't any JS for that anywhere on the page. Is it doing all of that using CSS somehow? Since we don't understand how opening the context menu works in the docs example, we don't understand why it isn't opening here. We'll try pasting the example straight in. This is surprising to us, but it seems the drop-down menu really is dependent on the label. In the docs, we assumed there was some JS being used under the hood to have the drop-down appear, but it seems the examples given to us were straightforward. We are not sure if we can use this. We'll have to pause to do some research. The screencast is ahead of what we are talking about, but we paused, thought about it, and realized that the reason the drop-down menu is appearing can only be focus. When the user clicks on the button, that has the effect of focusing the whole container, which in turn has the drop-down menu become visible. Instead of messing with focus like this, maybe we should just be using a regular menu, but when we get into a researchy mood, we have a tendency to explore. No, forget it. We have no idea why we are doing this, let us just plug in a regular menu. We omitted a part of the recording where we forgot to pass in the absolute class and spend a lot of time wondering why it was not appearing. In fact, looking back, it seems this was a problem with the drop-down menu. But even after we fixed that issue, we still couldn't get it to work as intended. We guess the drop-down menu must be focused using the button click. If you know how to make it work, leave a comment. Anyway, we are done with styling the menu. As far as the UI is concerned, we don't need to go any further than this. What we have to do next is implement the functionality to add the node to the model state. Almost done with the first part. We didn't realize that regular method definitions in TypeScript don't have a lexically scoped this. Instead, we need to use the arrow functions even in classes. Anyway, we were just moving things around, and now we have a feel for the React Flow library. What we will do next is actually add the node on click using that global manager class. JS being single-threaded has its advantages. Using a global class like this would be much more problematic in the .NET languages, as there we have to think about concurrency. We implemented on-click closures for the context menu, styled it, and implemented the node additions. This is really a great way to warm up into this series. Programming is at its best when done in a leisurely manner, step by step. Pushing it leads to a mental toll. In the next video, we'll make some custom nodes, style them, because those handles require surgical precision to hit at the moment, and put some useful functionality in them. Right now we are thinking how Houdini is designed, with multiple windows, a hugely complicated UI, and how much we don't like that. Blender's geometry nodes are quite simple, but they also lack the parameterization of Houdini's nodes. We'll have to look for a middle ground. Anyway, we know that what we just said probably means nothing to most of you, but don't fear. In the next video, we'll make the second step towards creating a visual novel compiler, and while we won't get something useful just then, we'll be a third of the way towards that. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. You've been watching Ghost Likes channel.